Sorry.
Okay, great. Chalo, koi baat nahi.
So this is new technology that we need to keep getting used to now. And every day there's a new
Yes,
platform
that's right.
on which you can do these kind of things.
Yes.
So we'll just wait for 2-3 minutes as people are joining in, and then we can start off.
Sure.
So the plan would be what I discussed with you, 15-20 minutes for you to talk, and then we'll have question and answers with students. I think there are a lot of requests from some of the AIIMSonians wanted to join in, and some other people also wanted to join in. So I think all of them have been given access. And while we have a capacity of 250, the YouTube link allows people to watch, and they can even ask questions, and those questions can be relayed to me, and I can then pose those questions to you.
Sure, certainly.
Hi, sir. Amboj here, Dr. Piyush.
Hi, Amboj.
Sir, just wanted to know the YouTube link is not very clear. So maybe if you could put it on the chat, some people may prefer being on YouTube, if it goes beyond 250. Okay. So if you could just put the channel, is it on the telemedicine channel? Or?
No, it's on.
Probably put it in the chat box. Then people could.
I will do that. Yeah. Or I'll ask Arushi. Are you there? Arushi, could you put it up? Otherwise, I'll look for. Yeah, I found it. Yeah, so Amboj, lots of people have put up the YouTube link.
Great, yeah. Hi, sir.
Pratap, are you there?
I'm around.
Okay, so shall we start or wait for another 2-3 minutes?
Maybe 3 minutes.
Okay.
So, who are the earlier speakers in this series, Piyush?
So, sir, the first two speakers were me and Tony Jacob. Tony is in anatomy. He's, I think, now an associate professor. Tony, is that right? Or additional?
Yes, sir. Now an associate professor. Associate, sir.
Okay, so Tony's associate professor. So he and I started off. Basically, we were the guinea pigs, trying out everything. The second group was Priyank. Priyank is also online, I think. Priyank is from the 1995 batch. Priyank, right?
The 96.
96 batch.
96, sir.
Yeah.
And Aditi.
So Aditi and Priyank did a session together. Aditi is in pediatrics. She's a faculty in pediatrics. So Priyank and Aditi are batchmates. Priyank's currently in the US. The third session was by Dr. Acharya. He was the lone person, lone speaker. And the fourth session was Aditi and two Deepti and Rachna, who were 95 batch or 96. They were also Aditi's batch. No, I think a batch junior to her. So
senior, 95.
95, a batch senior to her. One of them is in the US, one of them is in the NCR, and so that was an interesting session as well. So that's been the story up till now, and we hope to over the next few sessions, Ropen, Dr. Nandi, Pradeep Sharma for our presenter, Neerja, if she'll agree, uh, Dr. Vinod Paul, if we can manage to get him to speak. And we were currently doing it every Sunday, but we're now going to change to once a fortnight rather than every Sunday, because we thought every Sunday can become a bit too much for everybody. So people can get a breather in between. On every alternate Sunday, we would do it. So that was the plan.
Sure.
You should also try and reach out to Kshitij Kapoor after a very distinguished career in US as well as in UK. He has now become the Dean of the School of Public Health in Melbourne.
Yes, sir. I heard he'd moved there. We'll try and get him also. He's Alok's batch, so we'll ask Alok to get in touch with him and see if we can get him to speak. So we plan to get as many people as we want, as we can get, and see if we can get the students to get a wide perspective of how things were and how things have moved, and how they can plan things as they go ahead in their careers. So all aspects, basically letting them know that there is more to medicine than just just doing the books and the reading and getting overwhelmed by the fact that there are exams, and move on to things which would give them a different perspective of what they could look forward to as undergraduate students.
I'm very glad.
Sir,
I'm delighted that in this initiative.
Thank you,
I
sir.
wish it could have been a face-to-face interaction, but anyway, unfortunately, the times don't permit.
Sir, so actually it was all Pratap Sharan's idea. He started it off with the students and pushed all of us into joining the group. A number of other faculty are also actively involved, but it's essentially the students who were very keen on something like this. Sir, I think we'll start.
Thank you, Pratap, for the initiative.
Thank you, sir. A lot of us are involved. It's not only me.
Yeah, but the idea came from you and the students.
Well, as we're all fond of repeating nowadays, medicine and health are all also part of team science. Nothing can be done alone.
Pratap, shall we start now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, sir, formally, very good morning and thank you for agreeing to be part of this, the White Coat and Other Stories series. This is the fifth of the series, and as I said, the purpose behind it was to give students a perspective which was different from what they see morning, afternoon, evening in their classrooms. And we all thought that it'd be good to have people who've done different things over different periods of time to give them a perspective of that. So for those of the students and the people who are listening in, who of course everybody knows Professor Reddy, but those of you who don't know, a brief background: he trained to be a cardiologist. My first interaction with Sir was when he was doing his DM in cardiology. My grandfather got admitted with a complete heart block, and he was the senior resident on duty that day. I don't know if Sir remembers also, but that was my first interaction with him. The next major interaction was when he, along with Dr. Nandi and late Professor J.N. Pandey, started the National Medical Journal of India. Professor Reddy and Professor J.N. Pandey were associate editors, and that's the time when I had a large amount of interaction again with Sir. And then, of course, when he became the editor of the journal and I was the associate editor, I was continuing to work with him for that period of time. I have no hesitation in saying that there are very few people who can hold an audience with the kind of attention that Sir can, and his abilities to write an article. I often say in my talks, which I do on writing courses, I often say that very few people are gifted in writing, and their first draft can be the near perfect draft. But for most of us, we need to struggle. And Sir has the ability to do a near perfect first draft. I've seen a lot of these near perfect first drafts written as editorials, written as reviews, written as various kinds of pieces, opinion pieces. And so I'm not going to take more time, sir. So Sir is going to talk about decoding and delivering public health. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions at the end. But sir, over to you, and thank you once again very much for agreeing to do this talk. Thank you, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Piyush, for that very, very kind introduction. I must share a secret with everybody here who is listening in, that when I did become the editor of the National Medical Journal of India, and Piyush very kindly agreed to continue with the journal as associate editor, essentially all the hard work and hard lifting was done by him. I was essentially a notional editor, and I had accepted that responsibility only to prevent that journal being hijacked by some people who had some personal agendas. And it was essentially Piyush who managed the entire show and continued to build up the journal. I wish I could give him the same responsibility now of delivering this talk instead of me, but I don't think he'll let me get away with it this time. So let me now come to the topic that's been assigned, or I have also chosen. That is the whole issue of decoding and delivering public health. I must say the title of this series, The White Coat and Other Stories, is a bit of a misfit for me at this point in my life when I've shed my white coat. I loved my white coat, I was proud of it, and I enjoyed my life as a clinician. But having shed my white coat, I do not have regrets either, because I find my foray into public health was not only compelling but also rewarding over a period of time. And therefore, I'd like to share some of the reasons why that has happened. Of course, several of my colleagues in the world of cardiology thought that giving up my chair in cardiology and moving away entirely to public health was essentially madness. I'm not entirely sure that's off the table. I leave it to some others to judge. But nevertheless, I believe that this is an important move in my life. Firstly, what is public health? There's a fair amount of debate about what public health is. Is it the delivery of health services in the public sector by the public sector? Or is it a compendium of a variety of public services which influence health of the public? Or is it public financing of health, whoever delivers it? There's a lot of issues that actually have come in. And some people think that public health is nothing more than water and sanitation and public health engineering. So there are lots of perspectives that are there in society with very limited understanding of the full dimension of public health. So let me start with the definition that's been given by what used to be called the Institute of Medicine and now called the National Academy of Medical Sciences, National Academy of Medicine of the United States. So they said public health is what we as a society do collectively to assure the conditions in which people can be healthy. That's a pretty good definition, and that's generally what is accepted worldwide. However, there's a bit of a limitation here, which actually says what we do collectively as a society. It suggests that there is automatically some degree of harmony and consensus in the way we decide to do collectively, as though there is no dissonance and conflict. What do we do about the commercial determinants of health? What do we do about the tobacco industry? What do we do about the fast food industry? Are they sitting at the table and collectively deciding for what is good for common good and public health? So there is, I believe, a limitation in this particular definition. So my own definition, which I'd like to follow and expand upon, is that public health identifies and influences the determinants of health at the population level to impact on health and disease at the individual level. So this actually acts upon the determinants as well as the various risk factors and acts through policy interventions, system interventions, services, and community action. Therefore, even health system organization comes under the broader umbrella of public health, because unless a system is properly organized and resourced, you will not be able to deliver even that individual care properly, as we often recognize in hospital settings. So it is all of these as a conglomerate that actually comes under public health. You may say this is too broad a definition, but it is not necessarily confined to the so-called public health experts who have a public health degree. This is only to emphasize that all of us in different settings are actually players who can contribute to public health. And that's going to be the general theme of my talk today. So when we are actually looking at the various determinants of health, and we are familiar with what we think are the components of the health system and the so-called the pillars of the health system, which have been identified by the WHO, which are essentially related to the infrastructure, drugs, vaccines, and technologies, financing, information systems, governance, and of course, the health workforce. But we also must recognize that there are a number of social, environmental, and commercial determinants of health which act either at the broader societal level or through societal forces at the personal level. So there are things like water, sanitation, food system, environment, social stability, the development, economic development, and the distribution of the fruits of the development, as well as personal level factors like income, education, occupation, social status, gender, and participation in social networks. But underpinning all of these is the political and economic system, which determines how the health system itself is shaped in each of its elements, and also determines the various social, environmental, and commercial determinants of health. And it is not something that automatically comes through a very harmonious social consensus. It is always a contested space. And therefore, in that arena, we must try and see how best we can play our role to advance public health, whatever we may be actually doing in our individual capacity, even as clinicians or as health economists or public health epidemiologists. We all have a role to play and contribute to public health. Somebody put it rather well when they said, clinical medicine saves lives at the retail level. Public health saves lives at the wholesale level. So in a sense, we are actually acting at the population level. Both these are complementary and continuum. Even if you are a clinician and practicing very well to save lives, how well is the infrastructure developed? How is the hospital equipped in terms of human resources? Are they well trained? Are they well paid and motivated? Are the systems functioning effectively? Is there a stock out of drugs? All of these are system level issues which also have to be looked at the whole public health perspective, because they're not factors acting at the level of the individual patient, but inevitably they'll influence the health of the individual patient. So all of these essentially have to come under the rubric of public health, with an MPH degree or without an MPH degree, you still can play a role in advancing public health. So we have all of these issues coming in, but let me pick up economic development as one of the important elements. Now, we know that health and economic development have a bidirectional relationship. As countries progress economically, generally the population health improves, and there is a relationship between life expectancy and per capita income. This has been known as the Millennium Preston curve. But usually around $4,000 to $5,000 per capita income, this curve levels off and plateaus, and there is very little incremental benefit of an increasing income. But at whatever level we have the per capita income, we have also learned through a variety of research studies that within countries, the people who benefit in terms of health also depends upon the actual inequality within the country. In fact, at the same level of per capita income, different countries have different life expectancy, different health indicators, and a variety of other social indicators as well, where countries with higher levels of inequality fare worse than countries with lower levels of inequality. I mean, even if you look at the OECD countries, it's very clear that the United States has lower life expectancy than most of the OECD countries. And the contrast between Japan and the United States is particularly vivid and striking. So even as we in India progress towards economic development, and indeed we must try and accelerate economic development, we must keep in mind that inequality extracts a price, not only for the poor, but also for the rich in very many ways. You cannot prevent an infectious disease poorly controlled among the poor from striking the rich. COVID-19 is an example. People are sitting locked up in their multi-storied buildings and posh apartments, frightened of the migrants, frightened of the people in the slums. So inequality extracts the price from everybody in society. Now, this is where, again, it is not merely equality of opportunity. You have to create the right social conditions where we can foster as much equality as possible in various dimensions of human development. An economist of the early 20th century in UK called Tony said, what we need is not just equality of opportunity. We need equality of circumstances, an equal start, not just an open road. Because if you're malnourished, if you're suffering from a childhood anemia, if you're likely to be struck by malaria as a kid, you are unlikely to benefit from the equality of opportunity that comes later in life, either in education or in employment. So there are very many things that we need to look at from that point of view. And let's take nutrition as an example. We take, even now, 34.7% of our children are stunted. 33.4% of our children are underweight. 17.3% of our children are wasted. Now, again, here there is a differential between urban and rural areas, between different states and districts, and also between the rich and the poor. And we know that it's not merely susceptibility to infectious diseases that the state of undernutrition actually predisposes to, but also a huge loss of cognitive brain power. The nation as a whole loses, but individuals lose their opportunity for human development and even seizing the economic opportunities that are offered to them. When you look at anemia, for example, 40.6% of our children are anemic in the age group of 1 to 4 years. 39.5% of our adolescent girls are anemic. And as I said, it also not only mars their childhood, but casts a long, dark shadow even across their life course, because we now know from the Barker hypothesis and other studies that children who are born undernourished and grow undernourished, as they get into slightly better nutritional status, not necessarily near normal, but slightly better, they actually are metabolically programmed to develop, because of epigenetic mechanisms, a greater degree of body adiposity, particularly visceral adiposity, and early onset of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Further, we also know through epigenetic mechanisms that it's not just one generation that suffers. If a pregnant woman is malnourished and is carrying a female fetus, not only is the fetus epigenetically reprogrammed, but also the ova within that female fetus will also be epigenetically affected. So not only the yet to be born child, but the yet to be conceived child also suffers these consequences of intergenerational inequality. So we need to really look at inequality from that perspective. And while we may be practicing in our hospitals, and certainly we must, to the best of our ability, to provide as much relief to people in distress who come with an illness, we must also be conscious of some of these societal realities. Because as Rudolf Virchow said, and he was a famous pathologist, but he said, physicians are the natural attorneys of the poor. So we have to speak up for the issue of inequality and try and redress it. Now, if you look at under 5 mortality, for example, in India, we have at the moment 42 per thousand, and neonatal mortality is 23 per thousand. But there's a huge variation among our districts, among our 723 districts. The under 5 mortality at the moment varies between 8 and 88 per thousand among our districts, a 10.5-fold difference. The neonatal mortality varies between 6 to 46 among our districts, a 7-fold difference. And a girl child born in Kerala is 4 to 5 times more likely to survive till her first birthday than a girl child born in Assam. Now, is that what we really want? I mean, that kind of a disparity. Secondly, we must also recognize that our progress towards the sustainable development goals is not going to be that smooth, and it's further challenged now by COVID-19 and the effect it has had on freezing our health services in a single track mode. About 34% of the districts in India would need higher reduction in their under 5 mortality rate, and 60% of the districts would need a higher neonatal mortality rate reduction if we have to meet our sustainable development goals by 2030. So, given all of this, we see a huge problem. Of course, we do have programs which have to act in concert, like the National Health Mission, the National Nutrition Mission, and the Swachh Bharat Mission. But essentially, this points out to the fact that what we see in our outpatient department or in our wards are actually reflecting some of the wider social realities. There are many people in society who will be acting focused on that, whether it's water or sanitation or nutrition. But even if we are doctors treating in clinical medicine, we have to certainly become important agents for articulating the need for social action and political action, which can actually remove some of these conditions that create ill health. And that's where public health comes in. Now, how do we deliver public health? Clearly, we have to look at 3 complementary elements acting in concert. That is universal health coverage. Second is action on the social determinants of health, and I include the commercial and environmental determinants of health, because even when you look at climate change and the impact it's not only going to have on vector-borne diseases, which are going to increase as heat increases and humans become listless and lie wilted in the heat, the mosquitoes will become more energetic and climb to higher altitudes and spread far and farther, faster and farther. So therefore, we know that there are a number of vector-borne diseases. There's going to be a problem of water quality and water shortage. But do people realize that it's also going to greatly impact upon agricultural production and nutrition, for that matter? For every 1 degree centigrade rise in temperature, we are going to be seeing a 10% reduction in staples like rice and wheat, and also a great detriment in the nutritional quality of staples as well as non-staples. The fruits will ripen and rot earlier. So as it is, we have a nutritional problem, and this is going to get aggravated by climate change. So we have to look at how we can actually ensure better nutrition through agricultural changes, which are actually going to bring in better yields per unit investment in water, land, and energy. Of course, there are other experts going to be dealing with it, but unless people in public health and even in clinical medicine who are interested in the area of nutrition start articulating what the nutritional needs of society are and how you need nutrition as an instrument not only to remove undernutrition but also to combat non-communicable diseases, our agricultural scientists will only think of commercial profit. They'll never think of what is actually needed for ensuring nutrition security. They'll only think of food security. So you have to be the people who will have to change the dialogue, even if you're practicing in hospitals. Then, in terms of the universal health coverage, clearly we need a very strong effort to provide health services to all the people in society. Now, this has been defined by WHO as providing each person the essential health services he or she needs without suffering financial hardship. Now, the emphasis is also on quality essential services. So quality becomes important, essential services become important, but all become important, and financial protection becomes important. Now, clearly, you will say, this is a pipe dream. How can you provide services to everybody in society, all the services they might want? At the one time, we're going to get bankrupt and our budgets will not allow it. True. Therefore, WHO actually provides a cube in which they actually have three dimensions. One of the dimensions is population coverage. At any given time, how much of the population is covered by the service coverage. How much of the service is covered by the program? How many services are included? Then the third one is cost coverage. How much of financial protection is provided over time? How many people are actually saved from poverty? At the same time, maintaining fiscal responsibility in order to make sure that the budget doesn't go bust by over expenditure. Now, there are different stakeholders in society who will have different viewpoints. The politicians would look at service coverage, population coverage because they want to please more people. Clinicians would want more services because they feel that their patients deserve the best. The health economists and the policy planners would want cost coverage, both for poverty reduction and for fiscal prudence. There's always a dynamic tension between these three stakeholder groups, but ultimately we'll have to do at each time what we call resource optimization to do what is best for the people at that given time. And there we have to prioritize primary health care. Of course, hospital care is important. Care at all levels, primary, secondary, and tertiary care is important. But primary care, currently the most neglected, is going to be the most rewarding because everybody requires some form of primary care throughout life, whether it is immunization or whether it is the initial diagnosis of fever and COVID, whatever it is. Everybody requires primary care at some point in life. Secondly, they offer the widest plate of services. They also are the most cost optimizing, and they can actually prevent or slow down progression to severe forms of disease, which can actually flood the secondary and tertiary care hospitals. So they will be overall cost optimizing. So unless we actually bring that in and also recognize the role of technology-enabled non-physician healthcare providers at the front lines as a possible solution, because it cannot always be doctor dependent, need not always be doctor dependent. It can be certainly doctor guided, but not necessarily doctor dependent. Therefore, we do need to bring in a lot of transformation into our health services. So our interventions will operate at three levels. One is at the policy level, where we are looking at what are called non-personal interventions, which will have a population-wide impact, like tobacco taxes, higher pricing of junk foods and sugar-sweetened beverages, or even other issues related to environmental policy. All of them do not act directly on a person, but at the population level, they change the dynamics so that the persons will benefit. Second is community level programs. These are very important too. And they become particularly important whether you want to ensure that there is a smoke free community, or whether there is a facility for a safe and pleasurable physical activity, or even in terms of COVID, for example, some of the issues related to how actually we can do community level monitoring to find out for contact tracing as well as isolation. This is happening so very well in Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and elsewhere. So, where the community actually plays a very strong role. Then, at the level of individual protection, of course, there are a number of services that can be taken at the individual level for protecting one's health, but it is a system level issue as to how an immunization is delivered to an individual to protect that individual or not, or other elements of whether ORS is delivered in order to protect a child from suffering from severe dehydration. They are directly individual services, but it requires a system level approach in public health to deliver them. So we do have all of these in a very complementary manner. And we need to play our role in different places. We can't all be health economists. We don't need to be. We don't all have to be epidemiologists. We don't need to be. We don't all have to be health technologists, though we may be people utilizing the health technologies. We may have to partner with public engineers to produce technologies which are most appropriate for public health. We may have to talk to public health lawyers to see how tobacco control can be brought into appropriate law and legislation. After all, even wearing of helmets, which is seen as a law enforcement issue, has essentially been a public health issue. So we interface with many other disciplines, and that is very important for us to have that broad grasp. Because unless we speak up in the interest of public health, in the interest of a strong and stable and equitable health system, which enables us to deliver our best talent and best services, whether as clinicians or otherwise, we will be actually acting as mopping brigade of policies and programs gone wrong in other sectors. So we have to voice that. And indeed, now most research too in public health has to be a combined effort. Essentially, when we are talking about research, the purpose of research, whether in public health or clinical medicine, is to produce evidence informed, resource optimizing, context relevant, culturally compatible, and equity promoting recommendations for policy and practice. So our research also becomes transdisciplinary, because unless we actually join hands with social scientists, with health economists, we'll not be able to really bring in the changes that we need, even in health systems, in terms of what should be included in the universal health coverage package, or how systems should be modified for delivery of better services. So while we may be actually pursuing excellence in one particular area, which we must do as clinicians or researchers, because a certain amount of talent has to be fostered and built up to get that level of expertise, we have to be open to both understanding of and engagement with other disciplines in order to collaborate well. We started off by saying that even organization of this particular webinar series has been a team effort. Now we are moving into the area of team science. There is very little that an individual genius can do on the bench side alone, though sometimes bright ideas can be sparked by individuals. Therefore, we are actually, what we need to produce in medical colleges is T-shaped individuals, those who have a depth of expertise in one area, but at the upper limb, we have a breadth of understanding and sensitivity and willingness to engage with other disciplines. And only then we can advance public health or clinical medicine to the betterment of humanity. And ultimately, that is our purpose, to serve humanity best. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for this very engaging talk. While you've been talking, there have been questions coming through. The questions have been coming in through people who are logged in onto GoToMeeting and on the chat box, while there are other questions that are coming through on the YouTube platform as well. As well as that, we have a Google form which students can fill up and send questions to. So I'm going to start off by asking you something very. How have you seen a change in public health, the perception of the politician, the bureaucrat, the policy maker? Have you seen a change in these people as far as perception to public health is concerned over the last 2 decades? Or do you think it's still as good or as bad as it was 2 decades ago?
Well, I would divide the policymakers into 2 categories. One is the political decision makers, and second is the economist and bureaucratic decision shapers. The political decision makers are often people who like to see quick gains in a short period of time to advertise as the successes of their time in office. They like to see visible public symbols, just like the politician who handles the baby while going electioneering. They also like to cut ribbons for big hospitals or start off a number of mobile vehicles and flag them off. They serve a purpose, definitely. There's no doubt about it. We are short of good hospitals, we are short of mobile medical services. But primary healthcare, unfortunately, and particularly public health, does not give that emotional gratification to them. The beneficiaries of prevention and public health are faceless and nameless, and the anonymity of prevention actually doesn't give the politician that level of personal gratification. We have to make it quite appealing for them to identify with some measurable public health successes, whether reduction in child malnutrition or reduction in childhood diarrhea deaths or things like that. We need to do it. They do get frightened, however, when things like COVID-19 gets in or dengue and chikungunya get in. They are not particularly sensitized to non-communicable diseases, but there also we can actually try and get the message across that we can actually get a large number of people with hypertension detected and treated in the community, but also prevented in a number of ways. But childhood obesity, childhood addictions, as well as tobacco use are areas where they are somewhat more sensitive. The problem with the decision shapers, the bureaucrats, has been that they've been substantially influenced by the dominant economic thinking of the 20th century, which saw health as a non-productive expenditure, necessary but non-productive, unlike the engines of industrial growth. In fact, one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, who died in 2017, William Baumol, described health as a cost disease, that the costs keep going up without commensurate returns in benefits of services. But now we know very well that there is a bidirectional relationship, and number of commissions, starting with the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health of WHO, as well as 2 commissions on investing in health, have come up with clear-cut numbers which show that investing in health has a tremendous benefit. In fact, the last Commission on Investing in Health says that for low and middle income countries, a single dollar of investment in health will yield 9 to 20-fold, 9 for the low income and 20-fold for the middle income returns in health. So I think we have to keep pushing these arguments, but particularly moments like the COVID pandemic are psychologically opportune moments for us to sensitize them to the need of the health system strengthening and particularly bringing in public health to the forefront.
Thank you, sir. Sir, what I'll do is I will take the questions first from the undergraduates which have come in through a Google form, and then let you answer the questions which you could possibly see in the chat box as well. So the first question is from Manraj Singh, who's an undergraduate, and he says, in a pandemic, the need for effective and accurate communication of scientific knowledge is more important than ever. Yet we see huge lacunae in this area. How do you suggest that this can be corrected, and what are the pitfalls that prevent this from happening?
I entirely agree with Manraj, because risk communication is very important. There are three elements here. One is to give correct information so that people can actually act for personal protection and also act as a social group in order to protect themselves. The whole area of social protection also comes in. Secondly, for them to understand what the government measures are and why they are necessary. And therefore, they become willing participants and partners in the process. Third element is removal of stigma. And if we do not communicate properly, we create a huge fright and stigma, which is counterproductive in many ways. Not only other human beings are hurt, but people are afraid of coming forth, confessing that they have symptoms of a particular problem. And therefore, it goes underground, it gets buried underground in terms of revelation. And we never get the right numbers, and we can never do the proper isolation or contact tracing. Therefore, risk communication is a very, very important element. And I think overall, I think that has been where we have not been particularly strong. And the media has not played a very helpful role either. I'm not talking about this particular COVID pandemic. We have seen how in H1N1, about 15 years ago, there was utter panic created by the media. I think we ought to have much better risk communication and public education. And public ultimately have to become important partners in all of these efforts. I in fact say that we should have people partnered public health, and only then we can succeed.
Another question from one of the undergraduates, Mohak Gupta. He says, accurate, timely, and detailed data is imperative to guide public health policies in such an outbreak. Do you think the government could do better on the front of data transparency and sharing, at least with the top research institutions of the country? For example, data from contact tracing programs, which is extremely useful, epidata, which has not been released by the government.
I agree. I mean, we need as much data to be out in the open as possible so that people understand and competent research groups can actually analyze it and produce quick results. Actually, what we require is real-time data. And ideally, this competence should not be restricted only at the level of a few select institutions. Ideally, we must have district or block level or ward level data. And in some of the states, you are having ward volunteers and village volunteers who are actually gathering some of the data through syndromic surveillance. So that is an early alert system. So as much data that can be gathered and analyzed in a decentralized fashion, but nevertheless collated for trends at a higher level, that's going to be important. I think not having data to guide policies or to apply mid-course corrections can be a major problem.
So there are two more questions from the Google Forms and the YouTube, but I think we should also have some people asking questions from those who are in the GoToMeeting platform. Mohit Joshi, who's a faculty in the Department of Surgery. Mohit, could you go ahead and ask your question rather than me posing the question to sir?
Definitely, sir. Good morning, sir.
Morning.
Sir, I just wanted to ask that what was your motivation in joining the public health sector, leaving behind a lucrative kind of you enjoyed such a great professional career in cardiology here at AIIMS. So what made you move to the public health sector? Public health rather.
Let me say that even as a medical student, I was influenced by a lot of things that I was reading and felt that health is actually shaped by so many social determinants. And I saw that in action also as a cardiologist, initially as a younger cardiologist, but I had to trek around the villages around Ballabgarh and elsewhere, or even around Vellore, for a rheumatic fever and rheumatic heart disease control program started by ICMR. And there you see that it is actually poverty, and particularly a lot of poor people in the teenage years suffering the severe consequences of rheumatic heart disease, unable to afford surgery and unable to get proper anticoagulation even after surgery. Then you become very much more sensitive to the social conditions. Then you come and to coronary heart disease, then you see what kind of problems tobacco is causing. And then you find that you just can't keep on only doing clinical cure. Some of these conditions that create illness also have to be tackled, and somebody has to speak up for it. Then, of course, with that motivation, partly also to improve my own research skills, I went and attended a 10-day course in cardiovascular epidemiology and prevention. And that was a revelation, because I started understanding bias and confounding and other elements, which actually I think every clinician researcher also must know. It's very important to have that research methodology background, even if you are not a field epidemiologist. So then I went for a structured training in Masters in Epidemiology in Canada. That helped my research also, but that also broadened my overall public health understanding in terms of bringing in social sciences and health economics into greater familiarity. So I felt at one point in time that there are a number of people who are interested in practicing clinical cardiology and interventional cardiology, but not too many people pushing the public health agenda. And of course, I'm not the only clinician who stepped into that area. Professor M.K. Bhan did it, and a number of others have done it, who have gone from the clinical arena to much more of a public health oriented career. So I felt compelled as a cardiologist, initially seeing the relationship of poverty and rheumatic heart disease, and seeing the relationship of a number of social determinants like tobacco and fast foods to coronary heart disease, that even cardiology cannot only be treatment, cardiology also has to be prevention. And that's how I moved into that area of public health.
That was so nice, sir. But do you feel really content working there in the sector? Because I think, it's just a hard work leaving behind your lucrative career, and then you see over years nothing has changed much. So do you really feel content?
Well, let me say this. It's not an easy task. It's definitely a struggle. But every time you can actually score a bit of a victory, you feel content. Like, for example, I was the technical expert for the tobacco control treaty negotiations in WHO between 2000 and 2003. I was part of the Indian delegation, because the delegation composition kept changing between those 3 years. And remember, at that time, I was still a clinician, full-fledged clinician. But I became the spokesperson for India and for Southeast Asian countries and a number of developing countries. And we managed to fight a very tough battle with a number of countries to get a very strong public health treaty in place, the first global public health treaty that WHO led. So that was the cause for satisfaction. But there are a number of areas where you feel that enough has not been done or enough has not been achieved. But I get my satisfaction also by looking at a large number of young people who are training and are getting interested in public health. That is the most rewarding experience ultimately. Whether you're training medical students or whether you're training students in public health or a bridge between both, ultimately having young people who are getting enthused and energized is the most rewarding experience. There will always be disappointments anyway. You cannot push the agenda as fast as you can because there are so many competing social agendas and forces. But unless we start making an attempt, nothing will change. So we have to do that. And, the New Zealand All Blacks, who have won the most championships in world rugby, they have a motto: better never enough, better every day. So maybe things will get better every day if we keep trying better every day.
Thank you very
so
much,
for
sir.
sharing your
Priyank, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Reddy. This is very, very nice to hear you. Um I wanted to ask you about if you could comment on the role of academic medical institutions and the healthcare delivery systems in how they, what their relationship is to public health and what their role can be within it, and how well are these institutions and streams, public health, medical education, and healthcare system, with their own priorities, how are they streamlined and organized in India?
I strongly believe that the healthcare system and the education system, which in this case is the health professional education system, must be much more closely linked. I believe every medical college should take the responsibility, if not for a full district, at least for part of the district, and must be interwoven with that district health system. And a good deal of the research that is done, even in terms of postgraduate thesis, for example, could be directed at understanding the problems and finding solutions for that particular area. I mean, I'm not saying that absolutely top line innovative research must not be done. That must also be done. But there's a lot that medical colleges and nursing colleges can play in actually strengthening the district health system where they are located. And that must actually be built in, because that also makes you much more aware of your social responsibility as an educational institution. And the role definition of the young medical or nursing professional becomes better defined even during their formative period.
Are there ways in which you can? So, where is this conversation happening? At what level does this happen to push along either the medical colleges to assume that responsibility, become like citizens within the community? So that's one question. Like, how is it that the institutional priority can be encouraged in that direction? And a part two of that question is that, and I ask that question further down later in the comment field, but because I have the opportunity, I'll just put it right now. And complementary to the institutional agenda, what is the role that an individual faculty or student can have within it, while sometimes it's difficult to move things at a very high level?
True. Basically, I believe one of the problems is that our academic institutions have been positioned under the so-called health system administration, but have never been linked to the operational health system. And the more the linkages, the better it is. And we should try and provide it by making our medical colleges and nursing colleges part of that district health system delivery system. And as I said earlier, some of the problems will come up with the private medical colleges. They will not be ready for it. But I think essentially all national resources have to be utilized in this direction. And I think that is where our health system planning must move to. Not in a coercive manner, but certainly in a very directed manner. In terms of individual responsibility, I think, firstly, we all have to do our assigned and chosen work well. There's no doubt about it. But in addition, we have to also become, in a sense, the conscience keepers of the health system. And when we find the health system has a lot of flaws, we must try and highlight it individually as well as collectively and ask for redressal and change. That is important, because unless we raise those issues, whether it is drug prices or stockouts or even certain public health issues, as I said, whether it's tobacco or whether it is air pollution, we will be actually be playing our individual role as a cure agent and a caregiver well, but we will not be actually playing our role as a health professional well.
Thank you, sir. So we just go on to the two remaining questions which have come in through YouTube and Google Forms. Dr. Ashish Avasti says, millions of children die before the age of 1, but our health policy has evolved slowly. But with a great response to manage COVID-19, can we expect the same kind of response for diseases affecting the poor, other diseases affecting the poor?
I'm unhappy at the moment that we are on a single track agenda, that all our health system resources are essentially devoted only to COVID, important as it is. Our childhood immunization has suffered, our antenatal checkups have suffered, institutional deliveries have suffered, tuberculosis treatment will suffer, even though drugs have been given for 1 month or so. And now with other elements coming up, with this dengue, chikungunya, and so many others coming in, but also we recognize that even non-communicable diseases have not been attended to, though they are important risk determinants of COVID. And mental health is another casualty. All of these are issues that have to be dealt with. I agree that at the moment our under-resourced health system is dealing with a public health emergency. But this should be an important time for us to remind the policymakers that it is absolutely important for us to invest in a stronger health system. If it is functioning efficiently and equitably in a steady state in a non-emergency situation, then that health system can also very swiftly build the needed surge capacity when a public health emergency comes in. Otherwise, we'll be left tottering and dealing only in piecemeal fashion. And that is something that we must keep pushing. And one of the other things that we must keep pushing is the fact that our economy is slowing down should not be an excuse. Japan invested in universal health coverage in 60s after the Second World War left it badly battered. The UK invested in universal health coverage immediately after the Second World War. The Southeast Asian countries invested in universal health coverage after they suffered their economic crisis of the 90s. So we all recognize Rwanda did it immediately after the huge genocide and others, and they brought in to build up their primary healthcare system and universal health coverage. And they've all done well. Even when you're down and out economically, unless you build your human resources in terms of health and education, you will not be able to recoup even economically. That is the message that must go out loud and clear to our politicians and policymakers.
Thank you, sir. Sir, a second professional student, Chetan Garg. He says, I want to do an MPH from a good institution in the US after doing my MD in medicine. But I'm not really sure if an MD medicine will help me in my career in public health. I also don't know what kind of things, activities, workshops will help me to get into a good public health college in the US. Could you help him with some advice?
Well, you can actually do an MPH and gain a fair amount of understanding, if not of public health overall, but at least of research methodology, which will greatly improve your ability to both conduct and interpret research. Even if you're not conducting research all the time yourself, even to interpret published research, certainly this gives you a much better insight. But there are also programs like the DRPH, which are a little more oriented towards people coming in from a clinical background. You could think of that as an option as well. But why only the US? There are a number of other places, including India. But if you're interested in US, certainly there are good institutions where you can get a good DRPH or even an NPH. But certainly this is a complementary learning. It won't be a wasted learning.
Naman, you're on. Naman? So Naman, who was supposed to be your co-speaker, whom we pushed away to a fortnight later, he made a comment. I don't know if he can hear us. If he can, I thought I'd let him say what he was going to suggest. Naman?
Naman is not on the call anymore.
Okay. Tony, can you hear us? Tony? Tony is not on either. Vashish, will you go ahead and ask your question?
Hello. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I
Hi,
can hear.
so
Yeah,
I
go.
had a, so I think I'm doing. I've just finished the MBBS from AIIMS, and I feel that the curriculum here is geared towards. It's not geared towards, but it 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 gives an illusion as though super specialization is the only option. Like, and I think it's not just AIIMS, but many other colleges. Like, if you see Japan or other countries like the UK, where super specialization is systematically uh, not incentivized or discouraged, and it's made a tough process. But on the other hand, here super specialization is seen as the only way out. So my question is, like, do you think here super specialization is seen as a norm? How do you think medical students can be made more sensitized to community medicine? And like, why did you yourself do a super specialization if you were into public health?
Well, let me put it this way. When I went into super specialization, it was because I did like cardiology, because I did my initial house job in cardiology. Then during my MD medicine in All India Institute, I enjoyed cardiology. I enjoyed immunology as well, but then chose cardiology as my preferred career. But I was never totally disconnected mentally with the broader societal issues, and therefore that grew and grew. And when I felt that I had done sufficiently in cardiology, or even in terms of cardiovascular epidemiology, which was my chosen area of work in cardiology, I decided that I'll go for whole hog into public health, build public health capacity to have more multidisciplinary institutions of learning, which can translate into multi-sectoral actions for public health. And we didn't find too many institutions in India like that. Therefore, to try and establish those kind of institutions, I moved into the field in order to set up those institutions. But I agree that there is a career track in classical medicine to move into super specialty. Well, super specialty training is not something that you should scoff at. If certainly if that's something that appeals to you as your career choice, go ahead. What I'm saying is that even doing that, you can play a big role in public health. There's no reason that it stops you from playing a big role in public health. Bernard Lown was a Nobel Prize winning cardiologist. He didn't get the Nobel Prize in medicine. He actually was the inventor of the defibrillator. Not many people know that, but he was the inventor of the defibrillator. He got a lot of credit for that. He is the person who described the relationship between arrhythmias and the brain. So he is a very reputed cardiologist, but he also was a very strong votary of public health. And he is still at the age of 95. And he started the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War along with a Russian cardiologist in the 1980s when the Cold War was at its peak in early 1980s. And in 1985, they won the Nobel Peace Prize. So even in super specialty, you can still remain sensitive to the larger societal issues. But certainly, if you want to pursue a career in public health or family medicine, you don't need to be diffident about it. Go ahead and do it. Choose your career path. Ultimately, you have to be happy with what you have chosen. But wherever you are, you can play a role in public health. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you, sir.
Pratap, you had a comment. Or you had a question, sorry.
So I'm a mental health specialist, so sometimes it takes a slightly different. One of the issues that we face is the issue of the culture, in the sense that, for example, depression is a major public health problem, but when it comes to common people, they don't see depression as an illness at all. And something similar may be applying to other things like diabetes or blood pressure, which are not visible to people as such. So, how would the issue of culture impact public health, and whether in your work you have seen that as something which is important, or something where, or do you think universal methods usually would work across various cultures?
No, I think raising public awareness is a very critical element. And the way health professionals communicate also is a very important element. Sometimes we talk about health issues in a manner that actually creates, if not stigma, a lot of diffidence. Even in the COVID communication, frankly, as I said, the moment you say Vaishik Mahamari, everybody gets terrified. I mean, it could have been called COVID ki bimari, just like influenza, for example. Of course, we have to be more careful. But the moment you describe this, then people will start getting terrified and not only panicky, but shunning somebody who they suspect is having COVID or is a contact person of COVID. Depression in particular, mental health issues in general, have not really come out into the open because they've remained in the dark because of the stigma issue. I think the important thing is for us to point out that these are both not uncommon and certainly not irreversible and not untreatable or even irreversible. I think that is something that we have to talk about, and that is where I think our frontline health workers are going to be much more effective. And if we can actually train them in community engagement for health education and use other community groups also for actually educating people about some of these health issues so that the fear and the stigma goes away, I think that will be particularly helpful. It's always useful to have a Deepika Padukone come on TV and say that, okay, I've had depression and I've gotten out of it. Of course, she has married the biggest antidepressant person of all, Ranveer Singh, with all his energy. But in general, in the community, you have to get the community engaged, and it's the community networks who are most effective in spreading new knowledge and removing the fears.
Thank you, sir. Tony, if you're on, could you ask your questions, please?
So I heard the first part of your talk, and I wanted to ask you if epigenetics actually plays such a big role in determining generations of metabolism as well as health, as well as public health factors. So would investing in the public health provide any tangible benefits in the near future? Because if it is epigenetics, then at least 3 generations or 4 generations would be affected before they can start coming out of the deprivation that the earlier generation has been exposed to.
Well, I'm not an expert on epigenetics, and I was only quoting Kennedy from Oxford on this. But let me also mention to you that epigenetics are not, again, irreversible. We know that epigenetic changes can take place even during the person's lifetime through diet, exercise, and other altering mechanisms. So the imprint is not totally irreversible to the extent I know. And therefore, I think we have to do our best. And if not alter, at least to compensate. So I do not think we can leave somebody as being marred for life for this generation or the next generation without taking measures to protect. So we know that diabetes has been responsive, to diet and physical exercise, and 57% benefit in a number of clinical trials in preventing the progression from pre-diabetes to diabetes. So we know that there are a number of things that we can do and need to promote. The reason for pointing out the epigenetic link is that a lot of environmental influences impact upon our whatever gene expression is, and therefore we have to pay much greater attention not just to the genome but also to the epigenome. So those are the kind of things that we need to bring about in order to bring about changes in the social and environmental determinants. But again, neither is the genome a complete death sentence for anybody or irrevocable thing, nor is the epigenome certainly irrevocable.
Thank you, sir.
Arushi, would you like to go ahead and ask your question? Arushi is an undergraduate student, one of the students who's involved in getting this whole thing going, along with a lot of others.
Hi, Arushi.
Hello, sir. Sir, do you think that public sector, how do you think public sector institutes compare against private facilities for promoting public health? I mean, by private facilities, I mean institutes that work for this specific purpose, like the JSS or search. And do you think public sector institutes do an adequate job, or is it a failing of the like CCM departments in such places that leads to the need for such private sector institutes to come up?
By private sector institutes, are you talking about Jan Swasthya Abhiyan and Search as private sector institutions, or what are you talking as private sector institutions?
Yes, sir. These institutes.
Well, I would not call voluntary organizations who are doing good work as private sector institutions, because essentially they're not for profit and they're very people oriented, whether it is Jan Swasthya Abhiyan or Search for that matter, or JSS. So I would not look at them. They are non-governmental institutions, but certainly voluntary institutions. See, private sector you can divide into three categories. One is not for profit, second is for profit, and third is for profiteering. So let's stick to the first category, which is not for profit, and I salute them for their dedication and work, and we need them. But certainly, I believe the public sector institutions have a great role to play. They have been playing a great role, and they must continue to increase their impact, and they must participate much more energetically in capacity building and in public mobilization. As far as the CCM departments are concerned, they are also very variable. There are some departments which have been very good. There are some departments which have not actively engaged as much. I believe that they also must play a much greater role. And in fact, if you look at what's happening in the COVID-19 pandemic, many of the people who have been trained in community medicine and later on in field epidemiology are playing a big role. So I think we must actually ensure that these departments also become much more energetically engaged, except that only modification I would make is that they must also become much more multidisciplinary in their learning and research, whether it's health economics or social sciences or health technologies. Their mandate and ambit must expand.
Also, sir, yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Arushi, go ahead.
So you said that public health and clinical medicine is essentially a continuum. So do you think a sufficient experience in clinical medicine is essential before one can delve into public health?
It certainly helps to sensitize you better. It should not lock you up in the clinical medicine mentality to the total oblivion of public health sensitivity. But look at it. The reason I'm saying it's a continuum, let me explain why. In a clinical consultation, whether it is in a primary healthcare center or in a hospital, whether it's a doctor or a nurse, it is an individual interaction between the caregiver and the patient. But what caused the disease in the first place? What were the potential determinants that could have been corrected? Was the disease detected early enough? Was there surveillance? Was there an effective referral system? All of those issues are, before the person landed up, they come under the health system and the public health. What happens when the person leaves the room? Are the drugs available at affordable prices? Are nutritious foods available at affordable prices? Is there an isolation required? Is there rehabilitation required? All of those come under the health system issues, which are more system issues, and they come under public health, which also includes health services and systems. But even what happens in that room of where the consultation takes place, are there enough nurses? Are there enough doctors? Are they well skilled, well paid, well motivated? Is the hospital well equipped to perform all the tests required? That's also a system issue. Therefore, ultimately, you have to look at all of these as a continuum. and not as in isolation. And that is where, even if you are a practicing doctor, you have to definitely look at how the systems can be fixed better.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Arushi. Sir, we've got the last three questions now, or the last. Srinivas Rajkumar, people asking the question. If you're on.
Yes, sir. Sir, I just wanted to know the Central Institute, the profile of patients. I am Dr. Srinivas Rajkumar. I'm a senior resident in psychiatry. I just wanted to know, we as Central Institute, we get a different profile of patients compared to what I was seeing in Madurai Medical College. There we have our own community postings. We go to the real GH, like PHC, and we have like more access to like real public, we don't have like even daily income and other things. The similar equivalent lies in Ballabgad also. But central institutes which are mostly detached from reality of the country or even their own region, the kind of profile we are catering, how well informed are we to formulate the policies for people at large? And the second thing is, during crisis, it always becomes an opportunity not for us to push the public health agenda. The private players always focus on the deficiencies in the public healthcare system and try to capitalize on it by creating like very small models. For example, what Medenda had did is they were pushing the public-private partnership, even like taking over PHCs all over the country through Niti Aayog. And this time they had created a very small setup to cater to the private employees of corporate employees who were staying in Gurgaon. And they are pushing that it is a not-for-profit setup and that can serve as a model for the rest of the world. So crisis is used as an opportunity by corporate predators and not by the public health or government infrastructure. That, like, I want to put it on point, we see it as our opportunity to do public good, but that is not true. Capitalists are more equipped to like take this opportunity. So we should be on the offensive rather than on defensive to explain things. We should take our message like with far greater intensity than the corporates with their machinery does.
You should have been giving this lecture. Well, I agree with you in all respects. Let me deal with the two components of your remarks, more than questions, I would say. First is, how distanced are apex central institutes from the ground realities, and therefore are they best positioned to offer policy advice? I think it is absolutely important that apex institutes also have a much greater awareness of the ground realities. And particularly now, because we do not have a proper urban primary health care, we find a number of people coming in directly to some of these apex institutes, but that doesn't necessarily serve the purpose. If we did have a very good urban primary health care system, and we had a lot of community health centers distributed across the urban area, and if each of these institutes was also linked to many of them in their vicinity and had direct contact for and some responsibility for providing care in those urban centers, apart from the rural centers, then their understanding of ground reality would be much more. But I would certainly say that in future, most of the medical colleges that have to be freshly established have to be established in conjunction with district hospitals, so that the medical students might get much greater exposure to the sub-district health system on one side, and of course with some linkages to tertiary care institutions on the other side, but they are much more grounded in the reality. In terms of the policy disconnect, I believe those who are wanting to offer policy must have a greater familiarity with the ground reality, or at least converse with people who have a great familiarity with that ground reality in a respectful and receptive manner, so they get educated before they start offering a lot of policy prescriptions from what could be called an ivory tower. So that is important, and your point is very well taken. The second element is that will the private sector exploit this much more adroitly and adeptly in a more adept manner? any crisis to say that they are better off in providing services? Yes, they will, because they'll push their agenda. They want to take over district hospitals. They want to use the primary healthcare as a feeder service for their own hospitals. So we have to really challenge the premise on which these recommendations are being made, how effective, sustainable, and affordable these solutions are going to be, and offer alternative structures and systems that we can push forward. And certainly, we have to use the experience and examples of some of the states who have built up strong public health systems in order to, and public health care systems, in order to show other states that this is what works best. Look at COVID-19. When the crisis broke, we had to fall back on the public system almost entirely. So unless the public sector is strengthened, we are going to have a failure. Now, in a mixed health system, which has evolved by default rather than design, you cannot completely ignore the existence of the private sector. You may have to bring it in to offer services as per need and opportunity, but entirely as a part of a UHC design decided upon and steered and monitored by the public sector. So they have to be an extension of the public sector in that sense, but they cannot operate independently, and certainly they cannot take over that role as a primary care provider of public services. So I'm very clear about it. I fully agree with you. You wanted us to be more aggressive. Certainly, if you're more aggressive, I'll be behind you. Sure.
Thank you so much, sir. Like, this is the first time I'm listening to you. It was a very enlightening lecture, and we would like to be associated and know more about your works also. So if there somebody can create a WhatsApp group or some other means of Google groups or some communication by which we can be constantly in touch with your past lectures and also your future work, we will be more than happy, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Srinivas. Thank you, sir. Last two questions, sir. Ambuj, if you're on, could you please go ahead and ask your question?
Good afternoon, sir. Always a pleasure listening to you, the nuances you bring forth, as always, to things. I mean, on a personal note, I'm an old Shagird of sir and joined AIIMS as a research officer job on one of the WHO projects with sir, and just as a stepping stone to greener pastures abroad, but was highly influenced by the department and sir in particular, and then took my DM, and then, of course, the story is well known. Sir, but if I can ask you this question, I mean, it's been asked several times, and many a time people think that clinical care and public health are, kind of on opposite forces. So if I can ask you, your training as a cardiologist, how did that help you in your career in public health? And a quick second question is, we will like it or not, on whatever the semantics, the world generally is moving towards a so-called capitalist. The political economic structure is more of a capitalism than communism because of its failure in several places. Do you think that model is a bit of an antithesis to good public health?
Okay, the first question is, how did my training as a cardiologist and my role as a cardiologist help? It certainly helped because firstly, I started seeing the end result of neglected public health and poor health systems. So you don't only feel sad for the patient, you feel bad about the system. Therefore, you start wondering what are the problems that created those kind of illnesses or neglect. And then you try and see what can be done to fix it. So your public health sensitivity grows as your indignation at neglected diseases grows. But also, I must say, and I'm not saying this essentially to sort of anyway underrate non-clinician public health people. They have a tremendous role to play. But having been a clinician also gives you a sensitivity to understanding what the needs of people are in a health system. If you're just an epidemiologist or a statistician who have never really listened to a patient or the family, you start thinking of people as numbers. You don't see the human face, the human tragedy, the human need behind it. And therefore, the impersonal nature of your policy recommendations can be very problematic. So I believe having had exposure to clinical medicine also makes you a much more sensitive public health person. And you start reconciling both of them. So and equity comes in there as well. If you are purely a health economist and you have said, okay, this is cost effective, that's not cost effective, you must also recognize that there are some people who require life-saving treatments. And therefore, you have to bring in the equity dimension to balance the cost effectiveness. And that is where your clinical exposure brings you in as well. So I think both are very complementary and they can help each other quite a lot. And secondly, regarding the capitalism and communism, well, communism has actually not demonstrated success, unfortunately, because of extraordinarily poor leadership. And it turned out to be more of state capitalism and a considerable degree of anti-democratic autocracy, which led to a lot of failures. But neither has capitalism shown any success. You have seen repeated failures, whether it is a destroyed environment or and ecology, or a variety of diseases that have been unleashed because of maladapted modernity. You have seen failures, and of course, even in COVID, it's a huge failure in that sense. We have created a conveyor belt for zoonotic diseases, from forestry to veterinary population to human population, because of the way we have deforested, the way we have created captive bred large animal livestock populations to feed the fast food burger joints. I mean, all of these have actually created havoc. So I think we need a wire media. I believe in what would be a good balance of socialist equality with democracy. And without democracy, socialism cannot survive, and without socialism, democracy will not thrive. So I think that is where we probably, I mean, if you want me to make a political declaration, here it is. So I think that's where the future will have to be.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I mean, and I also must congratulate you for the excellent op-eds, that you've been writing on COVID, which has brought sanity to things like test, which was kind of, people never understood. All these fly-by-night epidemiologists who were trying to promote that. So congrats for bringing a lot of sanity to in terms of writings in public on COVID-19. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambridge.
Lajja, are you there? If you're there, please go ahead with your question.
Hello. Yes, sir. I'm here, and thank you for the opportunity. So I have two slightly different questions. So the first one is, what is your view on compulsory rural postings for fresh graduates, and especially to increase familiarity with ground reality and also to instill confidence as a doctor? Because I think most of us do MD simply because we're not confident to see patients just after passing MBBS. And the second question is, what are your views on insurance for all? So, for example, is the UK model feasible in India?
Okay, basically, I believe that compulsory rural postings in internship or posting people immediately after internship in rural areas is not necessarily going to be the solution for India. Partly because if you have been trained in a very different environment of tertiary care institutions, your familiarity and skills are not going to be adequate to meet the challenges immediately of rural primary health care. And that is going to be an issue unless you actually bring in a good deal of the formative training during medical schools to the field, and particularly both urban and rural primary health care and the district hospital level. So unless you actually bring in much more of that, neither the sensitivity in terms of acculturation, nor even in terms of the skill sets needed, is going to be there fully. And I think it would be very unfair to post a fresh, raw graduate from one of these institutions, from an urban tertiary care institution, into an under-resourced rural area without their having been prepared for it. They should be prepared throughout their medical career. So to deal with both the tertiary care issues, but also certainly much more with the primary care issues, both in rural and urban settings. So our medical education has to be reconfigured for that. Secondly, I would also say that from your second point was, can you just repeat that? Let me recollect that.
So regarding insurance for all.
Yeah, insurance. Okay. Now in insurance, the challenge is that you have to have a public finance system. We have seen all the insurance that has been tried under RSBY as well as the various state health insurance schemes, even though much of the money was flowing in from public finance, it did not actually reduce poverty, did not reduce the financial burden on the poor. 7% in 2004 and 7% in 2014 were impoverished of the population were impoverished because of unaffordable healthcare expenditure. So even while access grew, it did not help very much. And that is because we did not cover the needs of outpatient care, which is mostly primary care, but also continuity of care after discharge. And we did not pay for medicines, which are accounting for a large fraction of our out-of-pocket expenditure. So the classical insurance system will not work. What we require is a strong publicly financed system where at least, even if you have to do it in stages, make sure that there is an essential health package which is available to everybody. And then you can have an expanded package which is additionally resourced for the people who are much more vulnerable, poor or otherwise vulnerable, in order to bridge the health inequalities that exist. So equity exists in two dimensions. One is horizontal equity, in which everybody gets the same thing. Second is vertical equity, in which you try and bridge the equity gaps in health status by putting in additional resources or additional efforts to the vulnerable groups. So our process will have to begin with that. We have to do it piecemeal in stages. Primary healthcare has to get the highest priority. Some of the secondary healthcare, especially some of the surgical services, will also have to be included under that basic package. Life-saving tertiary care also needs to be included under that basic package. And then you can keep on adding other elements as more resources build up. But I do not think insurance is the way to go. But if you have to deal with Ayushman Bharat as it exists today and try and make something universal out of it, well, let's at least start saying that apart from these 40%, in the remaining 60% who are not covered by it, let income graded premiums be the way of entry into getting into that system so that you ultimately end up with a single payer system. But certainly we need a single payer system across the country and with as much public financing as possible.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your wonderful talk.
Thank you, Lajja. Thank you, sir. Sir, we're 10, 11 minutes past our scheduled time. We have one last question which has just come in. Can I pose it to you, or would you like to stop it here?
No, please. Certainly, no problem.
Sir, so Sumegha Mittal on YouTube says, sir, what are your views about the health budget being more focused on primary healthcare and the tertiary sector moving towards becoming self-sustainable?
Well, I think primary healthcare is absolutely critical. And we need to focus on both rural and urban primary healthcare, but build some sort of a continuity of care to secondary and tertiary care as per need, because those who need advanced care also cannot be completely neglected. So that needs to be done. But tertiary care becoming self-sufficient in the sense that if you leave it entirely to the private sector to charge whatever they want, or even the public sector to be given a free rein to charge whatever they want, you'll still have people who will not be able to afford it. And they will have to be covered, because otherwise you can have a lot of catastrophic health expenditure. So you'll have to think of a health financing scheme which actually protects people even from tertiary care expenditures. But if you have to initially prioritize the larger fraction for primary health care, that is appropriate. But you cannot completely abandon tertiary care entirely, because there will be people needing tertiary care partly because we have neglected many health conditions for too long. If somebody who requires renal dialysis, unfortunately, will require it, then we'll have to think about how best to achieve it. I mean, of course, you can still apply health economics principles and say, okay, home peritoneal dialysis with nurse technicians may be overall cost effective than peritoneal hemodialysis. Those are different decisions that will be made. But I don't think care, the tertiary care also can be completely left entirely to the market forces. But primary healthcare takes absolute priority.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. We've had a wonderful session. I think everybody who's listened in today has gained so much from listening to you, from your very incisive and appropriate comments on each of the questions, giving us an insight into how clinical work and public health can go hand in hand. The perspective that a lot of us could find it very difficult to understand, and that's again a perspective that you've been able to give to us very clearly. So we're very, very grateful to you. For those of you who have heard Professor Reddy for the first time, this will be available. This talk will be available in a recorded form on a YouTube link, and we can send it to you. Plus, there's a Google form for feedback, and please go ahead and do provide us feedback so we continue to improve on these sessions. Sir, once again, thank you very much for being with us for such a long time. Very grateful.
Thanks a lot, Piyush. It's a delight. I wish I could have stepped back into Holiday Institute today for the talk. The pleasure of being there. But anyway, I hope that day will come soon. Thank you.
Yes, sir. We would love to have you, and we hope there'll be a day when we will be able to get you to the institute in physical form to do a talk again. Thank you so much. Thank you.